Welcome to the deep dive. We take a pile of source materials, pull out the main ideas, and really trying to figure out what's most important.
Exactly. And today we're digging into some key excerpts from a really influential work. Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents.
That's right. We're going to explore Freud's perspective on, well, that fundamental clash between what we want as individuals, especially happiness, and what society or civilization demands from us.
It's a tension he saw as absolutely core to being human, a constant push and pull.
And our goal here for this deep dive is really to guide you through these, let's be honest, pretty challenging ideas. We want to pull out the crucial bits and get a clear sense of Freud's argument in these specific passages. This is for you.
Okay, so let's jump in where the sources start. Freud kicks off by observing that people often, well, they seem to use the wrong kind of yardstick for life.
Yeah, he talks about how much stark we put in things like power, success, wealth. We tend to admire people who achieve those things.
Right, and maybe overlook other things that could be more genuinely valuable.
Although he does acknowledge, there are exceptions. Those admired few who have totally different aims.
But he gets quickly to what he sees as a basic problem. Life itself is just really hard.
Yeah.
It brings too much pain, too many disappointments, tasks that just feel impossible. This kind of baseline suffering is just part of the deal.
Okay, so if life is fundamentally difficult, full of suffering, how do we actually cope? The sources lay out these different expedients is the word used, strategies to find happiness or maybe just to dodge the pain.
Yeah, he outlines a few key approaches. One is what he calls powerful diversions.
Powerful diversion.
Basically shifting your focus, your energy really intensely onto something else, away from whatever's causing the suffering.
Like what?
Well, the text mentions Voltaire's idea of cultivating one's garden,
Oh.
or deep engagement in scientific work, anything that just absorbs you completely.
So losing yourself in something.
Pretty much, diverting that psychic energy. Then there are substitute satisfactions. This is where the pleasure comes more from internal sources, fantasy, alternative activities, rather than directly from reality. Art is the big example here.
Ah, right. So art provides a kind of fulfillment that maybe reality can't.
Exactly. A real satisfaction, he argues, even if it's, based in imagination. And then there's the one that's maybe most obvious, but also risky. Intoxicants.
Yeah.
Anesthetics.
Using substances or maybe even like psychological states.
Yes, exactly. Things that numb the pain or give a temporary burst of pleasure.
But the sources warn about this one, right?
They definitely do. Freud points out the danger, that you're potentially wasting energy that could be used to actually try and fix the problems making you suffer in the first place. It's tempting, sure, but maybe not productive long term.
Okay, right. But there's one method that feels like it should be the answer. The one centered on love.
Ah, yes. Love. Seeking essentially all your satisfaction from loving someone and being loved back.
That sounds powerful.
Immensely so. The sources say it provides the most intense experiences of pleasure. Sexual love is kind of the prototype for happiness in this model.
But there's a catch. A big vulnerability.
A huge one. Relying on love makes you incredibly exposed. If you lose the person you love, or if that love isn't returned, well, the text says you're left completely defenseless against suffering.
That's stark. And the text mentions trying to spread that love out, like universal love, maybe like St. Francis, to avoid putting all your emotional eggs in one basket.
It does touch on that idea, transforming specific love into a broader affection for humanity. But then, and this is very Freud, there's an objection raised right in the source.
What's the objection?
That this kind of universal love loses value because it doesn't discriminate.
Mm-hmm.
And Freud plainly states his view that, frankly, not everyone is worthy of love.
Wow, okay. That's a blunt take on universal brotherhood. He also gives a nod to finding happiness just in beauty, right? The aesthetic approach.
Yeah, just appreciating beauty in nature, in art, people, even ideas. Taking pleasure from that experience itself.
So, with all these different paths people try, the conclusion about happiness itself seems kind of inevitable.
That it's deeply subjective. There's no single recipe, no golden rule for happiness that works for everyone.
Right.
And the sources really emphasize how pointless it is to try and compare happiness across different times or situations. Like, how happy was some ancient laborer versus a peasant during the 30 Years' War, or someone facing the Inquisition? We just can't know their inner world, their own ways of coping or numbing the pain.
Okay, so life's tough, we suffer, we try various ways to cope, some risky, some less so, and happiness is ultimately personal. Let's switch gears then to the other side. Civilization. What is civilization for Freud, and what's it supposed to do?
He defines culture civilization as basically the sum total of all the achievements and rules that lift human life above, our animal ancestors.
Okay.
And it serves two main purposes: protecting us from nature's power and regulating how we interact with each other.
Protection from nature, like shelter, but also rules for getting along.
Exactly. And he points to early examples, like the development of tools. He sees tools as extensions of our own organs, our senses and muscles.
Right, like engines extend our power, telescopes extend our sight, phones extend our voice.
All those examples. And controlling fire, he calls that an extraordinary and unexampled achievement. And here, the sources get quite psychoanalytic, linking it speculatively to instinct renunciation, suppressing primal urges related to fire, maybe even connected to early urination impulses.
Okay, that's definitely a Freudian spin you wouldn't get in a typical history lesson.
It's classic Freud, applying his theories to cultural milestones. Another example is building dwellings, which is interpreted, again psychoanalytically, as a kind of substitute for the mother's womb, a source of safety and comfort.
So civilization builds these protections, these structures, but there's a major downside highlighted straight away.
Yes, the cost. The cost is individual liberty. The text argues that freedom was probably greatest before organized society, but life was also incredibly dangerous. No protection.
Because anything goes, for good or ill. So civilization has to limit freedom for safety.
It has to. And for it to work fairly, justice means those limits have to apply to everyone. Now, the desire for freedom itself gets complicated.
How so?
It could be a justified revolt against unfair rules, which might actually help civilization improve. Or it could just be leftover bits of our primitive, untamed nature kicking against any kind of restriction, which would be hostile to civilization itself.
That sounds like the core tension right there. Finding some workable balance, an expedient accommodation between the individual's claim to freedom and the group's need for order. The text even asks if that's truly possible to resolve.
It's presented as a potentially endless struggle, and the sources suggest civilization itself develops through a specific process, almost like an individual growing up.
Civilization matures like a person.
That's the analogy, yeah. And this whole process deeply affects our basic human instincts,
Right.
leading to something the text calls cultural frustration.
Cultural frustration. That sounds bad. How does that happen?
Well, our instincts don't get free rein. They have to be changed, redirected. Often they're sublimated. The energy gets channeled into higher pursuits, like science or art or ideology, things that aren't directly sexual or aggressive.
Okay.
But the really crucial point, the sources stress this, is that civilization is fundamentally built on renouncing or not satisfying powerful innate instincts.
So holding back our deepest drives is the price of admission to society.
That's the core idea. And this required holding back, this renunciation, is pinpointed as the main reason for the deep-seated hostility that many people feel towards civilization itself. They resent its demands.
Makes sense?
And Freud draws this striking parallel between the civilizing process affecting the group and how an individual's own drives develop, mentioning, for instance, how anal eroticism might be transformed into culturally valued traits, like being orderly or thrifty.
Okay, so civilization protects us but demands we suppress or reshape our core instincts, causing frustration and resentment. This seems to be building towards another key and maybe darker idea in the sources.
It really is. A central claim is that humans are not naturally gentle creatures who just want peace unless provoked. According to these texts, we have a powerful, primary, innate instinct for aggression.
Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man.
Exactly that phrase. The sources point to history as evidence. Awful atrocities during migrations, the violence of groups like the Huns, the Mongols, the Crusaders, and, very fresh in Freud's mind, the horrors of World War I.
So he's not saying this is just a reaction to bad circumstances, it's built in.
He argues it's a primary instinctual drive, just as fundamental as any other. And this aggressive instinct is seen as this huge obstacle for civilization, constantly threatening to tear society apart. How can we live together if we're inherently hostile?
Which explains why civilization has to put so much effort into managing it. What tools does it use?
Several strategies are mentioned. Civilization uses force, the law, against criminals. It tries to build group bonds through identification and what's called aim-inhibited love affection that isn't sexual but still connects people.
Like camaraderie.
Sort of, yes. It also restricts sexual life, diverting that powerful energy. And it issues these really difficult moral commands like love your neighbor as yourself.
Which the text says is so hard precisely because it goes against our nature.
Exactly.
because our instinct might be to view the neighbor with suspicion or rivalry. The sources admit these methods aren't totally successful. Subtle aggression always finds a way through.
Okay, this feels like where we get into the really deep theory. The death instinct.
Yes, this is a major part of his later thinking. He proposes this fundamental conflict between two core instincts: Eros, the life instinct, driving towards connection, unity, building things up, individuals, families, nations, humanity,
Okay, the force for life.
and its opposite, the death instinct, or destructive instinct. This aims to break down connections, dismantle unity, return living things to an inorganic state, to undo life, essentially.
And the aggression we see, the wolfishness, that's the death instinct turned outwards? Precisely. A part of this internal drive towards dissolution gets directed onto the external world. That's where it shows up as aggression, destructiveness, cruelty towards others. Turning it outward, the text suggests, might even protect the individual from self-destruction.
Wow. So the whole story of civilization in this view is basically this epic struggle between Eros, the drive for life and unity, and the death instinct, showing up as aggression, playing out within our species.
That cosmic battle is presented as the very essence of life, the engine of human history.
And the sources mention that groups sometimes handle their own internal aggression by directing it outwards onto other groups?
Yes, the text describes this mechanism. Groups can bond by uniting against an external enemy, displacing their aggression. This is connected to what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences.
Narcissism of minor differences.
Yeah, the tendency for groups that are actually quite similar to develop intense hostility towards each other over small distinctions. The sources cite examples like tensions between neighboring countries, historical persecution of groups like the Jews, or, in the context of Freud's time, the persecution of the bourgeoisie in communist Russia.
And it's crucial, as you said, these are Freud's observations on group psychology, not endorsements of the actions.
Absolutely. Impartial reporting of his theory. And he notes that scapegoating doesn't actually solve the problem of aggression within the group long term. It's a temporary fix.
Okay. This seems to lead naturally into the final big theme, the burden of guilt. Where does that feeling, that conscience, come from, according to Freud?
He traces it back to childhood development.
Yeah.
Initially, guilt starts as a feel of losing love, specifically from parents or authority figures.
Ah, okay.
The child learns to renounce certain impulses or actions to keep that vital affection and avoid punishment. It's initially about external consequences, social anxiety, fear of getting caught.
But it becomes internal somehow.
Yes, that's the critical step. The internalization of that external authority. The parents' rules, their critical voice, get absorbed into the child's own mind, forming the superego.
The superego.
Right, and once that happens, the fear shifts. It's no longer primarily fear of the parent getting angry, but fear of your own internal superego. That's what we experience as conscience, as guilt.
And the superego is harsher, in a way. It knows your thoughts.
Exactly. The text points out that for the superego, just wanting to do something forbidden can be as bad as actually doing it. It blurs the line between thought and deed, making you feel guilty just for the intention.
Now, there's that really weird, counterintuitive idea about how conscience gets stronger.
Yeah, this is one of the most striking parts. Freud argues that conscience isn't just the reason we renounce instincts,
Right, we hold back because it tells us to.
but that the act of renunciation itself actually makes the conscience more severe. Every time you successfully suppress a strong drive, your superego seems to get tougher, more demanding.
That feels so backwards. Why would being good make your inner critic meaner?
It's a real paradox in the theory. He observes that sometimes the most outwardly virtuous people have the harshest consciences. He mentions saints who saw themselves as terrible sinners. The sources also note that external bad luck or suffering can intensify guilt too, making people feel they somehow deserved it.
So guilt is this complex internal thing ramped up by holding back and even by misfortune.
And he links guilt directly to anxiety. The sources basically say guilt is a specific kind of anxiety felt in relation to the superego.
Okay.
It can be conscious guilt, like feeling remorseful, or the kind you see in obsessive conditions. Or it can be unconscious, bubbling up as a need for punishment, or just that vague, pervasive feeling of unease, of dissatisfaction, the unbehagen, the discontent of the title.
Ah, the discontents are linked to this underlying, maybe unconscious guilt.
That's precisely the connection. This widespread societal malaise is tied to the psychological burden of guilt that civilization imposes. The sources also briefly mention how religions universally recognize this guilt, often called sin, and offer pathways to redemption.
Right.
The text specifically references the Christian concept of redemption through one person's sacrifice absorbing collective guilt, presenting it as an example of how religion addresses this psychological need.
So the big takeaway from the sources seems pretty heavy. Civilization's progress, which relies on us giving up instinctual freedom and managing aggression, comes at a real psychological cost. We end up with more guilt and potentially less happiness.
Yeah, civilization enables group life, but it costs us something significant in terms of individual ease and psychic freedom.
Which brings us right to that powerful final reflection in the sources. It feels like everything converges here. The search for happiness, civilization's demands, Eros versus death, the weight of guilt. It all leads to one massive question.
It does. The text concludes by asking this fundamental, urgent question. Can human cultural development actually succeed in mastering our own aggressive, self-destructive instincts?
Especially now?
Especially now, the text notes grimly that humanity has the power to literally annihilate itself.
That really raises the stakes on this whole internal struggle.
The book frames it as this ongoing epic battle between Eros life, connection, and its equally eternal opponent, the death instinct, the drive towards destruction. It's the core drama of existence.
And the ending is uncertain. It leaves the question open.
Completely open. Who knows which force will win out in the end? It poses the ultimate question for humanity's future.
We've really covered a lot of ground here, from the personal quest for happiness and how we deal with suffering, to what civilization is and what it demands, that huge struggle between life and death instincts, especially aggression, and finally this heavy burden of guilt and discontent.
It's a very comprehensive and, yeah, often challenging psychoanalytic view of being human within society.
So, thinking about Freud's perspective here, this idea of civilization as a constant struggle between unifying forces and our own destructive impulses, where do you, our listener, see that playing out today? In the world, or maybe even looking inward within yourself?
That's definitely something to chew on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.